So in the second part of the video tutorial, we're going to go and look at fixing up what we call the identifier issues. So that is things to do with where names are not very helpful, or they're incorrect. Things that, and actually in this code is sort of deliberately written to be terrible. It's almost deliberately obfuscating what's trying to go on here. And there are things in the code which, even if they're not errors, are just accidents waiting to happen to your code that really shouldn't be there at all. So the first group of things I want to look at are the import statements. So imports, of course, are where we bring functions into a Python code that we're writing. And there are some conventions that you should follow because they make it a lot less likely you're going to make some mistakes. And the first convention is that as far as possible we try to group all of the import statements at the start of the file. And that means we know where to go looking for when we don't, if we see a function being used in our code, then we know to go looking at the top of the file to see if it's being imported from a module, and if so, which module is it being imported in. So we're going to want to go and collect our import statements at the start of the file. The next thing we should do is we should avoid using from something import star. And the reason for this is legal Python. You are allowed to do this, but it's not a good idea. And the reason it's not a good idea is that you don't know in advance what exactly you're going to import from that module. I mean, maybe you've written the module yourself, in which case, well, you probably do know what you're importing. But if it's somebody else's module, you don't know what it's actually going to import. And that means it could end up redefining something that you were not expecting it to redefine. So, for example, if you did from numpy import sqrt, and then did from math import star, well, the math module has an sqrt function in it, so that means that although you'd imported sqrt from numpy, you've just clobbered it by importing everything from the math module. And the math module is something you shouldn't use. It's not as good as numpy. If you did Python at school and they taught you about using the math module, forget they ever told you that, just use numpy. And in this case, what happens is you've replaced a perfectly good and well-written and fast square root function from numpy with something which is slower and actually in some ways not as good, not as flexible from the math module, and it will go and cause you problems later on having done that. So avoid doing from something import star. Try to selectively import the functions you need, or alternatively, and many ways better, import the whole module but give it a nice little alias, which is why we do things like import numpy as np. Think very carefully, however, when you are using the as construct, that you're not going to just cause yourself confusion. And again, there's an example in the code we're looking at where it's kind of gone out of its way to be confusing. So particularly this is the case when you are doing from something import some function as something. Think carefully about why you're changing its name. Is that strictly necessary? I should say the other thing that you get when you do an import star is as well as clobbering a function already defined, you might clobber something which is a built-in. So Python will actually let you overwrite the print function with something else. So you can do have a module which defines a function called print. If you then do from that module import star, you will change what print does. And again, that is super confusing. So these are all good reasons why you want to be careful with your imports. Okay, so let's go over to the code. Remove the spurious characters I've just introduced, and let's start fixing up our imports. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move that up to the top of the file. So that's now grouped my 3 import statements up at the start. This is just nuts. From math import sqrt as cos. I mean, this is an example of doing something that's truly evil. Why on earth would you go and confuse people by calling the square root function the cosine function? So let's go and avoid doing that. In the code, that call is being done just in a couple of places. It's here. So let's change that to sqrt, and let's change that to sqrt, and then let's forget about doing that. And then actually we just need to import the sqrt function from NumPy. Now, in the previous part of this video, I said that we were going to introduce it to tell us that raw input was a problem, and you see it's now flagged up raw input here. The reason that's happened is I've removed the from NumPy import star. So now if there's anything that Python that the IDE doesn't recognize as being a variable that I've already defined, or something I've imported, or something that's already in the code, it's going to flag it up as a problem. And you see, actually here it is, it's flagged it up, and it said it's an undefined name raw input. And that, as I said, is because raw input was in Python 2, the Python 3 version is input. So we can very simply just change that like that. This is still terrible, by the way. This is still a bad thing to go and do, but it's not the worst thing we're doing yet. So again, dealing with our imports, you remember I said be very careful about why you're renaming a function. And up here we've got from string import split as s. And why would I do that? What is the point of making it shorter? Okay, it's saving me like 4 characters. That's not worth it for the confusion. So let's just not rename it to s and leave it as split. And now you see it's flagged up the line now that says it doesn't know what that is. So now what we can do is we can just put that as split. Okay, so that has cleaned up our import somewhat. There's one further thing I'd say here, and that is if we actually look at this line which you're using split, so what we're doing is we're doing something equals split, and then the arguments to split are a string and another string. And actually if we just quickly look at the documentation, so again in the video I've shown on introducing Spider, I've shown you how it's quite powerful because you can access the... Oh, it doesn't even exist in string. Oh, well that's a good reason not to do it. If we look at the documentation, then actually the correct way to go and do this, instead of using split as a function, it's what we call a method. In other words, what it is we do line ln dot split, then the brackets, and then the thing we're splitting on. So that's a sort of identifier error that we wouldn't have actually spotted until we tried running the code, that it just isn't a thing in that module. So we fixed that up, we've got rid of that import altogether. So now in fact we have it down to just one import and the rest of the code. And so that should take us to something which looks the same, let's zoom that up, as the version I have where I say I've fixed all the import errors. So that's the same code.